There's a moment in The Matrix, the first film, where Neo, the Christ figure, suddenly sees the Matrix, the ones and zeros that underlie reality, and he becomes invincible. And I started to think that power was a bit like the matrix of social change. That once you start to make power visible, see how power flows between groups, between individuals, see what triggers this redistribution of power, you start to think about change and activism in a different way. A colleague of mine at Oxfam, Jo Rowlands, wrote a brilliant book 20 years ago now on women's empowerment in Honduras. And she said, well, look, actually the first thing that happens is power within. It's the moment when people say, I've got rights, and they get a sense of dignity and agency. And that's often the thing that is overlooked, and it's often the most important thing in a process of social change. Once people have those kind of light bulb moments, which may be moments or maybe long drawn out experiences, they look around and they find people in similar situations and they start to organise. And then it gets interesting. So we had this project in Nepal, women's discussion classes. Women were very isolated in Nepal, so what we do, our local NGO partner organised for them to come to a safe space, which was women only, with invited speakers, and they would choose the topics for discussion, starting to build a bit of a network and a bit of a sort of social support network. Within 2 months, the conversation had turned to how do we burn down the liquor stalls and smash up the gambling dens, okay? Because the liquor stalls were selling booze to the men, and the men were getting violent, and then they were spending all the money in the gambling dens. When people have power with, and they start to organise, whether it's in trade unions or women's discussion classes, then they start to exert power over the formal bit of power, which is what we normally understand as power. So the power to make decisions, allocate resources, change policies. When it gets to formal and sort of the more formal end of power, we are quite instrumental in how we do it. We've got this thing called power analysis. And this is an example from Tajikistan. And we're doing some interesting work on water and sanitation, which are in a dire state in Tajikistan. We'd spent some time in the villages, and then we came back and said, okay, 2 by 2, how much do the different players in the village care about water and sanitation? Sorry, how much do they care, and how influential are they? If they care, but they're very uninfluential, so people with terrible services, for example, then do we need to find the equivalent of the Brahmin? How do we help them get more influence? How do we help them move up there? Is it through organisation? Is it through contacts? Is it through advice? What is it? If they're influential and don't care about water and sanitation, then good academic institutions have a simple solution. Another report should do it, right? And it occasionally works. It usually doesn't. So you want to think about other tactics as well. So for example, is it about the messenger rather than the message? Will these people, if they hear it from someone they fear or respect, change their views on water and sanitation? Can you flip the incentive so it's in their interests to think more about water and sanitation? What can you do to get those people over there? So you're getting as many people into the top right-hand corner, and then you can get some interesting coalitions going and you can get some change processes underway. Now that looks very reductionist, but we've used it on everything from villages in Tajikistan to global climate change campaigning, arms trade treaty. It's just a useful way to map out who's in the game and what you need to do with the different players in the game. So I think it's quite useful. The other part I wanted to talk about is the systems. There's a wonderful phrase from Donella Meadows, who wrote a book called Thinking in Systems, saying if you want to influence the system, you have to learn to dance with the system. And dancing with the system is in stark contrast to what the aid business and actually a lot of activists do, which is they bake cakes. So to make a cake, you need ingredients, you need a recipe, you need an oven. You can predictably produce a cake-like object. It may not be as nice as that, but you can say, if I do this, I'll get a cake at the end of it. And when you have a cake, you can say, that's because I followed the recipe and had the right ingredients. That is the project. But there's a problem with this, because we're applying these linear systems of prediction and attributable change in places like this. Okay? So this is a famous leaked US military PowerPoint. Not a sentence you hear that often. And it's from Afghanistan. The General Petraeus and his team had commissioned a consultant to try and understand who talks to who and who influences who in Afghanistan. So what you've got is a stakeholder map, and the arrows are influence, right? When this was leaked, it made it to the Jon Stewart Daily Show, which is as big as you get, really, because everybody laughed at it. And I saw it and thought, wow, that's fantastic. That's a really serious effort to understand a complex system. Now, a complex system has so many connections and so many feedback loops that if you poke it, you cannot predict what will happen. And if change happens, and these systems change all the time, you cannot know for sure why. But we're going into these systems with projects and with cakes. And I think that leads to all sorts of high levels of stress and high levels of waste in terms of brain power and money. The questions we ask What kind of change? We've talked a lot about policy and practice, but I think Trump and Brexit drove home the importance of underlying social norms. How do we feel about the other? How do we feel about belonging? How do we feel about nation? These kind of issues activists have not been looking at a lot, certainly not in my part of activism. They've been thinking about policies and tax reform and, nice, tangible, short-term things. So how do we do things differently if we're going to think about norms? Precedents, learning from history, learning from success around us, something that activists surprisingly don't do very much. There's a really interesting book called The Power of Positive Deviance, which looks at the positive outliers and what you can learn from them on any given issue. And then the final thing, which is all the rage at the moment, is feedback and course correction. So instead of saying we're going to do this for 3 years, what you do is we say we're going to do this for 3 months, and then we're going to have a stand back, and we're going to see what works and what doesn't. We're going to have good feedback systems in place, and then we're going to course correct and move on. And sorry, funder, you're going to have to accept that because you really want us to carry on with something that isn't working. That's the alternative. And that's an interesting conversation at the moment, which we're having with the funders, and to be honest, the funders are ahead of us on a lot of this stuff. Oxfam moans a lot. We have a lot to moan about. We moan about climate change, we moan about poverty, we moan about violence against women. If you stand back and think what's happened since 1945, we've had the age of development. We've had an extraordinary period of human progress on income, literacy, rights. We can carry on in that age of development mode, but we have to work differently if we're going to keep moving forward.